America, a land of vast rivers, deep forests, and wide open skies. When I was born, it was not yet a nation. It was a collection of colonies, tied to a distant crown, and filled with uncertainty about its future. And yet, within this land, the seeds of liberty had already been planted. My name is George Washington. You may know me as a general, a president, or perhaps as a statue in marble. But before all those things, I was simply a boy of Virginia, a young man seeking purpose, a husband, a farmer, and at times, a reluctant soldier. I did not imagine, as a child, that I would one day lead an army, much less a country. I was not born into nobility. I did not inherit vast estates. I was not destined, by any earthly measure, to shape the history of millions yet unborn. And yet, through the circumstances of my life, through hardship and fortune, through failure and perseverance, I was placed at the heart of the founding of a new nation. I invite you, then, to walk with me through the years of my life, to stand with me as a boy in the fields of Virginia, to march beside me in the wilderness, where the clash of empire first reached my ears, to endure the bitter winters of war, when freedom seemed but a fragile hope, to witness the birth of a new nation, and the uncertain steps it took beneath my care, and finally to return with me to the quiet of Mount Vernon, where I sought nothing more than to live as a simple farmer, even after the world had made me its symbol. This is not legend, this is my life, and it begins on a cold February day, in the year of our Lord, 1732. I was born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia. At that time, Virginia was the largest of the 13 British colonies, a land of plantations and small farms, of rivers that carried tobacco to the sea, and of people who worked the soil with both pride and hardship. My family was not poor, but neither were we of the highest rank. My father, Augustine Washington, was a planter of moderate means. He had served his colony and owned land, but he was not a great lord. My mother, Mary Ball Washington, was a woman of remarkable strength. She was not gentle in her ways indeed. She could be stern, unyielding, and demanding, but she instilled in me a discipline that would shape me for life. When I was but 11 years old, my father died. His passing left our family with responsibilities far greater than our means. My education was not what some might expect of a man who later bore the title of president. I never attended university. Circumstances did not allow it. Instead, I studied what I could, when I could, writing, and arithmetic. But I found a particular talent and passion in mathematics, and especially in geometry. I loved the precision of lines and angles, the certainty that truth could be drawn upon a page. It was this skill that would open my first path in life, surveying. Those were years of hardship, but also of discovery. I slept under the open sky, my bed no more than a blanket upon the ground. I endured storms and biting cold, and at times, hunger gnawed at me when provisions ran thin. Yet I also saw beauty beyond measure, the morning mist rising over the Blue Ridge Mountains, the endless forests that seemed to stretch to the horizon, the rivers that glimmered like silver under the sun. Surveying taught me more than mathematics. It taught me endurance, self-reliance, and above all, an understanding of this land. For as I measured acre by acre, I came to know that America was vast, rich, and full of promise. I came to love the soil beneath my boots and the fields I marked upon my maps. During these years, I also learned how men judged character. The planters and landowners I served did not know me for my family name. Indeed, it carried little weight. They judged me by my honesty, by my diligence, and by my willingness to labor faithfully. And I found that honesty, once earned, was worth more than gold. I recall once being sent to survey a particularly rugged tract of land. The owner had doubts about the fairness of previous surveys. For days I labored, through rain and tangled forests, marking every line with care. When I returned, wet and weary, he looked over my work and said simply, "This young man can be trusted." It was a small phrase, yet it filled me with pride, for trust is the foundation upon which all else must stand. My childhood and youth were not without simpler joys. I loved to ride indeed. From boyhood I became known as a skilled horseman. I remember, even as a youth, mastering a spirited horse that others thought impossible to tame. The thrill of the ride, the bond between man and animal, became for me both sport and necessity, for in those days travel meant hours in the saddle. I also enjoyed the company of my brothers and friends. We hunted together, fished in the rivers, and shared laughter in simpler times. Though my future would carry me far from those carefree days, I always cherished the memory of that Virginia youth. As I grew older, I sought more than just work and family duty. I sought honor. In the colonies, honor was often measured by land, by reputation, and by service. Though my family could not send me abroad to study, nor raise me into the highest circles of society, I was determined to prove myself through ability and character. And so, as a young man of Virginia, I stood at a crossroads. I had measured land and proven my reliability. I had felt the weight of family responsibility and the discipline of a stern mother. I had tasted the wilderness and learned to endure. But destiny had more in store for me than the quiet life of a surveyor. For soon, the clash of empires would reach even our colony, and I, eager for honor, would step onto the path of war. My early years as a surveyor taught me to endure hardship and to know the land, but they also awakened in me a longing that could not be satisfied by chain and compass alone. I sought honor. I sought recognition. And in those years, honor was most often won not in the fields of peace, but upon the field of war. The colonies, though far from Europe, were not free from its struggles. Two great powers, Britain and France, both claimed dominion over the heart of this continent. The Ohio Valley, rich in rivers and fertile soil, became the prize over which they quarreled. And so, in 1754, the French and Indian War began. It was called by other names abroad, but to us in Virginia, it was the moment when the shadow of empire fell across our frontier. I was but 22 years of age when I first took command. Lieutenant Colonel of the Virginia Militia, such was my title. It sounded grand, yet the reality was far less so. My men were farmers and woodsmen, brave in their way, but lacking discipline. Our weapons were poor, our supplies uncertain, and our training little more than instinct. Yet in my heart, I felt both excitement and determination. Here was my chance to prove myself. In the spring of that year, I led my men into the wilderness. Our orders were to challenge the French advance, to secure the territory for Virginia and for Britain. It was a task far beyond my experience, but I embraced it with the zeal of youth. We came upon a small detachment of French troops. A skirmish followed. Shots rang through the forest, echoing among the trees. When the smoke cleared, the French commander lay dead. I had fired my first shots in anger. It was the spark that lit a wider fire. Soon after, we hastily constructed a small stockade fort necessity. We called it. Never was a name more ill, for it was a poor fort, hastily built, ill-positioned, and vulnerable. In July of 1754, the French, with their native allies, descended upon us. Rain poured from the heavens, soaking our powder, turning the ground to mud. My men fought bravely, but disorder spread. We were outnumbered, outmatched, and at last I was forced to surrender. The terms of that surrender were bitter. I signed my name to a document, written in French, that I scarcely understood, and which accused me of assassinating the French commander in that first skirmish. When I later learned what I had signed, my shame burned deep. It was my first taste of true humiliation in war. Yet though my pride was wounded, I resolved to learn. I resolved never again to be so unprepared, never again to underestimate the enemy, never again to trust to chance what should be secured by discipline. The following year, I joined the army of General Edward Braddock. The British had resolved to drive the French from the Ohio Valley, and Braddock led a great force into the wilderness. I rode as his aide, eager to observe the methods of seasoned soldiers. But on July 9, 1755, disaster struck. As we marched near the Monongahela River, the forest erupted with musket fire. The French and their native allies ambushed us with deadly precision. The British regulars, trained to fight in open fields, could not withstand the chaos of the woods. They fell in heaps, their red coats bright targets among the trees. I remember the scene vividly. Smoke hung thick, men shouted, horses screamed, and the air was filled with terror. I rode back and forth, carrying Braddock's orders, trying to rally men who could scarcely see their enemy. Bullets tore through my coat. 2 horses were shot beneath me, falling lifeless as I scrambled clear. And yet by Providence alone, I was untouched. When at last, General Braddock fell mortally wounded, I helped carry him from the field. The army was broken, retreating in disorder. Of the thousands who had marched so confidently into the wilderness, hundreds lay dead. It was one of the greatest defeats the British army had ever known upon this continent. In the days that followed, men whispered that I was a man preserved by fate. For how else could one explain that I, though in the thickest of the fight, escaped without a scratch? 4 bullet holes were found in my coat, yet not one touched my flesh. Was it destiny? I cannot say. But I felt in my soul that I had been spared for some greater purpose. That battle taught me the cruelty of war. It taught me that courage alone is not enough, that discipline and preparation are as vital as bravery. It also taught me humility, for I had once thought war a path to glory, but I learned that it is also a path of suffering and loss. In the years that followed, I continued to serve in the Virginia militia. I rode the frontiers, defended settlements, and saw more bloodshed than I ever wished. The war dragged on, year after year, with victories and defeats, until at last Britain prevailed. When peace finally came, I had gained experience, but not the recognition I once dreamed of. I had hoped for a commission in the British Army, to rise as a professional soldier under the King's colors. But that honor was denied me. To the British, colonial officers were of lesser rank, and my service, however faithful, was not enough to break that barrier. At first I felt bitterness. I had risked my life, endured the hardships of the frontier, and yet was passed over. But as time went on, I came to see it differently. Perhaps it was for the best that I remained tied to Virginia, to my land, and to my own people, rather than to the distant commands of London. What I carried from those years was not titles or honors, but knowledge. I had seen the face of war. I had learned how to lead men, how to endure hardship, and how to remain steady when fear threatened to consume all. And so, though my youth had sought glory, I emerged from the French and Indian War with something greater, the conviction that leadership is not measured by triumphs alone, but by endurance in the face of failure. This was my first taste of war, bitter, humbling, yet shaping me for all that was to come. For little did I know, then, that far greater trials awaited me. Trials not for empire, but for liberty itself. And the next time I marched to war, it would not be as a soldier for Britain, but as a commander for America. When the guns of the French and Indian War at last fell silent, I returned not as a triumphant general, but as a weary colonial officer. I had no commission in the king's army, no reward from London, no honors to place upon my name. What I carried home was experience, a reputation for courage, and a longing for a quieter life. That longing drew me back to a place I cherished above all others, Mount Vernon. It was not yet the great estate people now imagine. At first, it was a modest plantation that had belonged to my elder half-brother, Lawrence. Lawrence had been my mentor, a man of refinement who introduced me to circles of society I might never have known. But he died young, leaving me with grief and a responsibility. Through inheritance and careful management, Mount Vernon came into my hands. I remember those first years of working the soil there. The rhythm of the seasons, the planting and harvesting, the tending of livestock. The building of fences and barnsies became my daily occupation. Though war had given me a taste of action, it was the earth that gave me peace. I walked the fields at dawn, feeling the dew upon the grass, the mist rising from the Potomac River, and I thought, here is where a man may find contentment. But no man lives by land alone. A home is not complete without a family, and Providence once again guided my path. In 1758, I met a woman who would change the course of my life, Martha Custis. She was a widow, still young, and of considerable wealth, having inherited land and fortune from her late husband. But what mattered most to me was not her riches, it was her kindness, her warmth, her ability to make a house into a true home. I recall the day we first met. Her carriage had brought her to a gathering, and she stepped forth with grace that needed no adornment. Her eyes carried both strength and gentleness. We spoke, and though the world around us was filled with chatter and music, I felt a quiet understanding pass between us. Our courtship was not long. In January of 1759, we were married. It was a simple ceremony by today's standards, but for me, it was the beginning of a partnership that would endure for 40 years. Martha brought with her 2 children, Jackie and Patsy. I had no children of my own, but from that moment, I became a father to them. In their laughter, I found joy. In their tears, I found the responsibilities of parenthood. Though I could never claim them as my blood, I loved them as my own. Together, Martha and I built a household at Mount Vernon that was filled with life. Friends and visitors came often, for Virginia society was bound together by ties of hospitality. The dining room echoed with conversation, the halls with music and footsteps. Martha was the heart of it. All her presence brought warmth that my stern nature alone could not provide. At Mount Vernon, I devoted myself to the science of agriculture. I studied new methods of planting, experimented with crops, and sought to improve the land. I shifted from tobacco to wheat, for tobacco exhausted the soil and left it barren. I built mills to grind grain, developed fisheries along the Potomac, and sought always to make the estate self-sustaining. There was satisfaction in this work. To see the fruits of labor rise from the ground, to walk among fields that had been barren and now flourished, these were triumphs no less real than victories on the battlefield. I often thought that, had fate allowed it, I would have been content to spend all my days as a farmer, tending my land and living in peace with family and neighbors. Yet even in those years of peace, I could not remain untouched by the wider world. The colonies were changing. The weight of Britain's taxes, the restrictions on trade, the growing sense that we were treated not as free men but as subjects of distant masters, these murmurs reached even the quiet of Mount Vernon. I listened, I observed, but I did not yet imagine the storm that was to come. Still, Mount Vernon was my refuge. When I walked its fields, when I looked out across the river at sunset, when I sat with Martha in the evening, listening to the laughter of our children, I felt that I had all a man could desire. Marriage taught me something war never could. War had taught me discipline, courage, and endurance. But marriage taught me patience, gentleness, and the strength that comes not from command, but from partnership. Martha steadied me. She gave me a place to return, a hearth to warm my spirit, a reason to bear the burdens that lay ahead. Looking back, I know that without her, I could not have borne the weight of what was to come. For soon, the peace of Mount Vernon would be broken. The call of duty, louder than the call of the land, would once again draw me from my home. And this time, it would not be in service to the King of Britain, but in defense of the rights and liberties of America. But for those precious years, I lived as a planter, a husband, and a father. I rose with the sun, worked with my hands and with my mind, and ended each day in the comfort of family. They were years of preparation, though I did not know it then, years that gave me the stability, the perspective, and the strength I would later need when the world around me descended into conflict. Thus, the chapter of war gave way to the chapter of home. And in that home, I found the foundation upon which the rest of my life would stand. When I returned fully to the life of a Virginia planter, I believed perhaps naively that peace would last. The rows of wheat stretching across my fields, the ships moving up and down the Potomac, the gatherings of neighbors at church or at harvest time, all these seemed to promise stability. But beneath that calm surface, discontent was spreading, like a fire smoldering unseen beneath the ashes. The war against the French had left Britain burdened with debt, and Parliament looked to the colonies to share that burden. To them, we were subjects who owed not only loyalty but coin. To us, we were partners in an empire, loyal yet deserving of respect. The distance between these two views grew wider with every passing year. The first shock came with the Stamp Act of 1765. Suddenly, every legal document, every newspaper, every license required a stamp purchased from the crown. It was not the amount of money that stirred anger, it was the principle. We who had long governed ourselves in our assemblies were now told to pay taxes decreed by a parliament in which we had no voice. No taxation without representation. The cry rang out across the colonies. I did not raise my voice loudly in public at first, but in private, I too felt the injustice. In my heart, I remained loyal to Britain. I wore her uniform, I fought under her flag, I admired her traditions of law and liberty. But I also cherished the rights of Englishmen, which I believed extended to us in America. To be taxed without representation was not liberty, was tyranny in disguise. At Mount Vernon, I often hosted neighbors and fellow planters, and in our conversations, the topic turned inevitably to Parliament's actions. The Sugar Act, the Quartering Act, the townshend duties, one imposition followed another. We debated, we argued, we wrote letters to friends in other colonies. The sense of grievance was not confined to Virginia. It spread like a chain of fire up and down the seaboard. I recall the day word reached us of the events in Boston in 1770. British soldiers had fired upon a crowd, leaving men dead in the snow. It was called a massacre. Whether accident or provocation, the blood of colonists spilled by redcoats hardened hearts. Even in distant Virginia, we felt the tremors. If it could happen in Boston, it could happen here. Still, I hoped for reconciliation. I was not a man eager for rebellion. My fields, my family, my life at Mount Vernon, these held me fast. But each year, Britain seemed determined to test our patience further. The Tea Act of 1773, designed to rescue the East India Company by granting it monopoly power, struck many as an insult. In Boston, patriots disguised themselves and cast the tea into the harbor. The response from Britain was swift and harsh. The coercive acts, which we called the Intolerable Acts, closed the port of Boston and stripped Massachusetts of self-government. What was done to Massachusetts today, we feared, might be done to Virginia tomorrow. In those years, I found myself drawn deeper into public life once more. I was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, where I stood shoulder to shoulder with men like Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, and Richard Henry Lee. Patrick Henry's words still ring in my ears: "Give me liberty or give me death." They were not the outburst of a fanatic, they were the cry of a people awakening to the reality that freedom and submission could not coexist. I remember walking the streets of Philadelphia after those sessions, the air thick with both fear and hope. We were not yet rebels, we were men pleading for justice. But I felt in my bones that Britain would not listen. The pride of Parliament, the arrogance of ministers in London, they would not bend to our petitions. And if they did not bend, they would break us. When I returned home to Mount Vernon, I knew my life was changing. I resumed my labors in the fields, but my mind was often elsewhere, on the debates in Philadelphia, on the plight of Boston, on the whispers of militia training in every colony. I ordered my own militia company, drilled and ready. For though I did not yet know the hour, I sensed the storm was approaching. The winter of 1774 turned to the spring of 1775. The word reached us like a thunderclap. Shots fired at Lexington and Concord. The blood of farmers and townsmen shed upon the green. The war had begun, though no one had formally declared it. The distant quarrels of Parliament and Congress had become musket fire and cannon smoke. I felt the pull of duty once more. This was not a quarrel in which I could remain a spectator. I had fought before in defense of empire. Now, I would fight in defense of liberty. When the Second Continental Congress assembled in May 1775, I returned to Philadelphia. I wore my uniform of a Virginia colonel, for I wished no man to doubt my readiness to serve. The debates were fierce. Some still clung to hope of reconciliation. Others already spoke the word independence. But amid the uncertainty, one truth became clear. We needed an army, and we needed a leader. To my astonishment, the choice fell upon me. John Adams of Massachusetts rose and placed my name before the Congress. He spoke not only of my military experience, but of the need to bind the colonies together, Virginian to lead the soldiers of New England. The motion carried, and in June 1775, I was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. I accepted with humility and with fear. I told Congress I did not feel equal to the command I was honored with, that I would accept no salary, only the repayment of my expenses. Yet I could not shrink from the duty. The die was cast, and I knew I must give myself wholly to the cause. As I mounted my horse and began the journey north to take command at Boston, I looked back in my mind to Mount Vernon, to Martha, to the fields, to the peaceful life I was leaving behind. I did not know if I would ever see it again. I only knew that my country called, and that I must answer. Thus ended the chapter of grievances and resolutions, and thus began the chapter of war. The rising tensions between Britain and her colonies had reached their breaking point, and from that fracture, a new nation would be born if we could endure the trials to come. When I accepted the command of the Continental Army in June of 1775, I knew the task before me was immense. I had seen armies before, trained, equipped, disciplined. What I inherited at Cambridge, outside of Boston, was no such force. They called themselves an army, but they were, in truth, a gathering of farmers and tradesmen, each with his own musket, each bound more by passion than by discipline. Yet, in their eyes burned a fire I had rarely seen in professional soldiers, the fire of men defending their homes, their liberty, their very future. When I arrived at the encampment, the men cheered, though I did not yet deserve their trust. I walked among their tents, spoke with them, learned of their hardships. They lacked powder, shot, clothing, food, everything an army requires. And yet they stood before the might of Britain, whose fleets ruled the seas, and whose redcoats had conquered empires. It was David against Goliath, and I was chosen to hold the sling. My first months in command were consumed with the work of forging order out of chaos. I insisted upon drills, upon cleanliness, upon respect for the chain of command. Not all welcomed these demands. Some men deserted, some officers grumbled. But I knew discipline was the soul of an army. Without it, enthusiasm would falter at the first clash of steel. The siege of Boston tested us. The British, under General Howe, held the city. We held the surrounding heights. We lacked cannon to force them out until a miracle of ingenuity and labor brought us what we needed. Colonel Henry Knox, a bookseller turned soldier, dragged artillery all the way from the captured fort at Ticonderoga, across frozen rivers and snowbound trails, to our camp. When we placed those guns upon Dorchester Heights in March of 1776, the British found themselves exposed. Rather than risk destruction, they evacuated the city. For the first time, the great empire retreated before us. Hope soared in every heart. But victory in war is fleeting. No sooner had Boston been secured than I knew the next blow would fall upon New York. The harbor, deep and wide, invited the King's Navy. The city, central and strategic, was a prize neither side could ignore. I moved my army south, hoping to defend it. What followed was among the darkest chapters of my command. In the summer of 1776, even as Congress in Philadelphia declared independence on July 4th, my men faced the full might of Britain on Long Island. Tens of thousands of redcoats and Hessian mercenaries, supported by towering ships of war, bore down upon us. We fought bravely at the Battle of Brooklyn, but we were outmaneuvered, outnumbered, and nearly surrounded. By God's grace, under cover of fog and night, I ferried my entire army across the East River to Manhattan, escaping destruction by the narrowest margin. Yet retreat followed retreat. We were driven from New York, from Fort Washington, across New Jersey, our numbers dwindling, morale sinking. The cause of liberty seemed ready to perish before it had truly begun. I recall those days with a heavy heart, the ragged columns trudging through cold mud, the cries of the wounded, the despair in the eyes of my officers. Some whispered that the rebellion was finished. Even Congress fled from Philadelphia to safety. But in my soul, I knew we could not yield. Liberty, once glimpsed, could not be surrendered. I prayed for strength, and a daring thought came to me, to strike when least expected. On Christmas night, 1776, with the Delaware River choked by ice, I led my men across in small boats. The storm lashed our faces. The river threatened to sweep us away, yet onward we pressed. At dawn, we fell upon the Hessian garrison at Trenton. They were unprepared, still heavy with sleep and holiday drink. In less than an hour, we had captured nearly 1,000 prisoners with scarcely a loss. Hope was reborn. Days later at Princeton we struck again, defeating British troops and slipping away before reinforcements arrived. The winter of despair gave way to a season of renewed faith. The war was far from won, but we had shown that the cause yet lived, that the spirit of resistance could not be extinguished. The years that followed were long and bitter. At Brandywine, at Germantown, we fought and bled, but could not dislodge the enemy. Philadelphia fell to the British, and Congress fled once more. At Valley Forge, in the winter of 1777–78, my army endured suffering beyond words. Naked feet left bloody trails in the snow. Men huddled in huts, starving, shivering, sick with smallpox and fever. I walked among them daily, sharing their misery, listening to their complaints. Some cursed me, some wept, some swore they would leave at the first chance, yet most endured. And in that crucible, through the training of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer of rare talent, our ragged army was transformed into a force of discipline and skill. By the time spring came, and we marched out of Valley Forge, we were no longer a mob of farmers, we were soldiers. At Monmouth, in June of 1778, we proved it, meeting the British in open battle and holding the field against their might. Though the war dragged on, though victories and defeats came in turn, from that day the enemy no longer dismissed us as mere rabble. The years stretched on. Fighting moved south Savannah, Charleston, Camden, Kings Mountain, Cowpens. Our allies, the French, entered the war, bringing ships and men that tipped the balance. Still, the struggle seemed endless. My hair grew gray with worry, my body weary with toil. Yet I would not abandon the field. At last, in 1781, fortune placed before us the chance to strike a decisive blow. General Cornwallis, commanding the British in the south, entrenched himself at Yorktown, Virginia. There, with the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse blocking escape by sea, and my army marching swiftly from the north alongside our French allies under General Rochambeau, we laid siege. For weeks, cannon thundered, trenches crept closer, redoubts fell. At last, Cornwallis, surrounded and without hope of relief, surrendered. The war, for all practical purposes, was won. When his soldiers marched out to lay down their arms, I stood in silence, watching. I did not exult, I did not gloat. For I knew the cost the blood shed at Bunker Hill, the frozen bodies at Valley Forge, the long years of sacrifice. Victory was sweet, but it was paid for dearly. Even then, peace was not certain. The war dragged on in distant posts, negotiations faltered, tempers flared. But in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and Britain at last recognized the independence of the United States of America. The dream that once seemed impossible had become reality. I resigned my commission that December. Standing before Congress in Annapolis, I told them I returned to private life, to seek the quiet of my farm. I asked nothing for myself. No crown, no reward, no power. I wished only to be a citizen once more. Tears filled the eyes of many in the chamber. They had feared I might seize authority, as conquerors so often do. But I desired no throne. My greatest ambition was to live as I had before, to lay down the sword and take up the plow. Thus ended the great contest of arms. I had begun as a planter. I had been forged into a soldier. And now I longed only for peace. Whether peace would last, whether this fragile union of states could endure, I did not know. But I knew we had earned the chance to prove that free men, united in common cause, could govern themselves. And for that chance, I was willing to stake all that I was, and all that I had ever hoped to be. When I laid down my commission before Congress in December of 1783, I believed perhaps naively that my service to the public had come to an end. I returned to Mount Vernon with a heart full of gratitude, eager to embrace the quiet life of a farmer once more. How sweet it was to walk the fields at dawn, to hear the rustle of the wheat, to feel the soil in my hands. I oversaw the planting of crops, the construction of barns, the tending of orchards. I rode my lands on horseback, conversed with neighbors, welcomed guests, and sought to mend the years of absence I had imposed upon my family. At last, I thought I might be allowed to grow old in peace. Yet even as I mended fences and sowed fields, I could not wholly turn my mind from the affairs of the new nation. For though independence had been secured, the Union itself seemed fragile, uncertain, precarious. The Articles of Confederation, our first frame of government, proved weak and ineffective. Congress lacked the power to raise revenue, to regulate trade, to enforce its decrees. States quarreled with one another over boundaries and tariffs. Debt mounted, soldiers went unpaid, and discontent simmered. In Massachusetts, Shays' Rebellion revealed the peril of disorder, as angry farmers took up arms against their own government. I watched from afar, troubled, uneasy. Was this what we had fought for? Had we cast off the tyranny of Britain only to collapse into chaos of our own making? Letters poured into Mount Vernon, letters from fellow soldiers, from statesmen, from ordinary citizens, all asking my opinion, my guidance, my voice. I replied with caution, for I did not wish to be drawn once more into the public arena. But deep within, I knew the truth. The nation required something stronger. A government that could unite the states, secure the blessings of liberty, and command the respect of the world. In 1787, when the call went forth for a convention in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation, my name was put forward as a delegate from Virginia. I hesitated. I had tasted the burden of leadership, and I did not wish to shoulder it again. Yet my friends, men such as James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, insisted that without my presence, the gathering might falter. They argued that the people trusted me, that my reputation for integrity could give legitimacy to the enterprise. Reluctantly I agreed. Thus I journeyed to Philadelphia in May of 1787, entering once more into the service of my country. The delegates assembled in Independence Hall, the same chamber where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years before. 55 men, representing 12 states, gathered with one purpose, to save the Republic. On the very first day, I was chosen unanimously as president of the convention. I accepted with solemn humility, aware that my presence was more symbolic than practical. I did not speak often in debate, preferring to listen as others argued. But I presided with firmness, ensuring order, discouraging rashness, urging compromise. The debates were fierce and often bitter. Some wished for a strong central government, others feared it would trample the rights of the states. Some demanded representation by population, others insisted upon equal votes for each state. Slavery, that dark shadow upon our land, cast its presence over every discussion, though few dared confront it directly. Day after day, week after week, the arguments raged. The debates were fierce and often bitter. Some wished for a strong central government, others feared it would trample the rights of the states. Some demanded representation by population, others insisted upon equal votes for each state. Slavery, that dark shadow upon our land, cast its presence over every discussion, though few dared confront it directly. Day after day, week after week, the arguments raged. At times it seemed the convention might dissolve in failure. But through patience, persuasion, and the spirit of compromise, a new framework began to take shape, a constitution that created 3 branches of government, balanced against one another. A Congress to make laws, an executive to enforce them, a judiciary to interpret them. It granted powers to the central government, yet preserved the sovereignty of the states. It established checks and balances, safeguards against tyranny, protections for liberty. When the final draft was signed on September 17, 1787, I felt both relief and apprehension. Relief that we had not failed, that we had produced something worthy of the sacrifice of the revolution. Apprehension, for I knew that paper alone could not guarantee success. The true test would be in the hearts and minds of the people. Would they ratify it? Would they obey it? Would they cherish it as their own? I returned once more to Mount Vernon, hopeful that my role was ended. I had presided over the convention. I had lent my name to the cause. But now, surely others would carry the work forward. I longed to remain among my fields, to watch the seasons turn, to savor the peace I had earned. But fate, it seemed, had other designs. For whispers soon reached me, whispers that the people, and indeed the framers of the Constitution themselves, looked to me as the natural choice to lead the nation under this new system. I resisted. I had no desire for power, no hunger for office. Yet the call grew louder, insistent, irresistible. The people would accept no other. Thus, even as I tended my land and sought the quiet of private life, I knew in my heart that destiny was summoning me once again, that I would be compelled to lay aside the plow and take up the mantle of leadership. For the work of liberty was not yet complete, and my duty, it seemed, was not yet done. When the Constitution was ratified and the machinery of the new government prepared to move into motion, I sincerely hoped that my name might be spared from further service. Yet the voice of the nation rose with unanimity, so remarkable that I could not mistake it. The electors chosen by the people's representatives cast their votes, and every single one was given to me. Thus, in the spring of 1789, I was called once more to leave the peace of Mount Vernon and undertake a duty I had never desired, to serve as the first president of the United States. I accepted with deep reluctance, for I feared that the weight of expectation might prove too great. No one had walked this path before. There was no model to follow, no precedent to guide me. The Constitution gave form to the government, but it was silent on many particulars. It would fall to me to set examples that might endure for generations. On April 30th, 1789, in the city of New York, which was then our nation's capital, I stood upon the balcony of Federal Hall. A vast crowd filled the streets below, their voices hushed, their eyes lifted toward me. Robert Livingston, Chancellor of New York, administered the oath of office. With my hand upon the Bible, I swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. When the words were spoken, a cheer erupted from the multitude. Cannon roared from the harbor, and church bells rang across the city. My heart was heavy with humility. I did not rejoice in power. I trembled at responsibility. I prayed silently that heaven would grant me wisdom, patience, and strength to guide the infant republic through its uncertain beginnings. In those first months, every decision was a matter of consequence. How should the president be addressed? What ceremonies were fitting for the office? How should the executive interact with Congress? Even the smallest details carried significance, for they would establish traditions. I sought a middle path, neither monarchical pomp nor excessive informality. I chose to hold weekly levees where citizens and officials might meet me, but I avoided ostentation. I wished to embody dignity without arrogance, authority without tyranny. Perhaps my most important early task was the selection of the officers who would form the cabinet. For the Department of State, I chose Thomas Jefferson, whose wisdom and experience as Minister to France were beyond dispute. For the Department of the Treasury, I appointed Alexander Hamilton, a man of remarkable intellect and energy, though often too fiery for his own good. For the Department of War, I selected Henry Knox, my faithful comrade from the Revolution. And for Attorney General, Edmund Randolph, a Virginian of sound judgment. These men, brilliant though they were, seldom agreed with one another. Jefferson and Hamilton, in particular, were as oil and water. Jefferson wary of centralized power, Hamilton eager to strengthen the federal authority. Their disputes filled my council with tension, yet I valued their differences. For from debate, truth might be discovered, and from discord, balance might be achieved. Hamilton pressed forward with a bold financial plan. He proposed that the federal government assume the debts incurred by the states during the war, that a national bank be established, that revenue be raised through tariffs and excise taxes. Jefferson and Madison opposed him bitterly, fearing that such measures would enrich the wealthy and bind the people in chains of financial dependence. I listened carefully to both sides, weighing their arguments. At last, I gave my support to Hamilton's plan, believing it essential to establish the credit of the new nation and to secure confidence at home and abroad. This decision, though necessary, sowed the seeds of division. From these disputes grew the first political factions, Federalists on one side, Republicans on the other. I lamented this development, for I feared that parties would inflame passions, pit neighbor against neighbor, and endanger the unity we had sacrificed so much to achieve. I warned repeatedly against the spirit of faction, yet the tide was not to be stopped. As I strove to strengthen our institutions, I also sought to preserve peace. The storm of revolution that swept France filled America with conflicting sympathies. Many hailed the French struggle as the natural companion to our own. Others feared the excesses of mob rule, the violence and bloodshed that accompanied it. When war broke out between France and Britain, pressure mounted for the United States to take sides. I resolved that we must remain neutral, for our nation was young, fragile, unprepared for foreign entanglements. In 1793, I issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, declaring that we would pursue our own course, free from the quarrels of Europe. This decision was not universally popular, yet I believed it vital for the preservation of our independence. Within our own borders, challenges arose as well. In 1794, discontent over a federal excise tax on whiskey erupted into open defiance in western Pennsylvania. Farmers refused to pay, threatened revenue officers, and raised the specter of insurrection. I could not allow rebellion to take root in the soil of our republic. With heavy heart, I called forth the militia of several states, and, for the first and only time during my presidency, I led the troops in person. The show of force was enough. The rebels dispersed without bloodshed. The authority of the federal government was affirmed. Through all these trials, I longed for nothing so much as retirement. After 4 years, I wished to step aside, to return at last to Mount Vernon. But the entreaties of friends and the fears of the people persuaded me to serve a second term. I accepted, though reluctantly, and endured another 4 years of toil, criticism, and burden. I watched as party spirit grew fiercer, as newspapers assailed me with venom, as even old comrades doubted my motives. I bore it all in silence, for I believed that my example must be one of restraint and patience. At last, when the second term drew to its close, I resolved firmly that I would not serve again. I published my farewell address, in which I gave counsel to my fellow citizens. I urged them to cherish the Union, to resist the lure of faction, to avoid permanent alliances with foreign nations. I spoke not as a commander, nor as a president, but as a friend bidding farewell. My words, I hoped, would outlive me, serving as a guide for future generations. On March 4, 1797, I surrendered the presidency to John Adams, chosen by the people as my successor. As I left the capital and returned to Mount Vernon, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I had walked the path no man had walked before. I had done my utmost to plant the foundations of Republican government. Whether those foundations would endure, only time would tell. But my part, at long last, was finished. Thus I stepped down, not to seize power, but to relinquish it. And in so doing, I hoped to prove to the world that in America, the people not the ruler were sovereign, and that liberty, once won, could be preserved by virtue, restraint, and the consent of the governed. When I laid down the mantle of the presidency in 1797, I felt as though a great burden had at last been lifted. The years of command, the endless councils, the ceaseless storms of politics all were behind me. I returned with relief to Mount Vernon, to the fields and forests that had ever been my truest home. How sweet it was to walk once more among the orchards, to ride across the pastures, to see the familiar Potomac glistening in the sun. I devoted myself to the management of the estate, to the improvement of agriculture, to the company of my dear Martha and the circle of family and friends. I rose early, as always, and found contentment in labor, both simple and steady. The cares of government were no longer mine. My days were filled instead with the rhythm of the seasons. Yet even in retirement, the nation was never far from my thoughts. Letters arrived daily, bringing tidings of disputes in Congress, of foreign dangers, of the widening rift between the political factions. I answered as best I could, though I longed to be left in peace. I knew that the destiny of the Republic lay not with me, but with those who would come after. Still, duty called once more, in 1798. Tensions with France had risen to the point of near war, and President Adams, fearing conflict, appointed me commander-in-chief of the Provisional Army. Though my years were advanced, I accepted, believing that if the country needed me, I must not refuse. Fortunately, the crisis abated before troops were engaged, and I was spared the pain of returning to battle. Thus my final service to the Republic was one of readiness, not of arms. As the century drew toward its close, I often reflected upon the astonishing journey of my life. I had seen the colonies grow from scattered provinces to a united nation. I had watched the people rise from subjection to independence. I had lived to see a constitution framed and a government established. I asked for no higher blessing than this, that liberty might endure, and that my countrymen might guard it with wisdom and virtue. In December of 1799, I rose one morning to survey the farm, though the air was raw and the snow falling thick. Upon my return, I felt a chill seize me. By evening, my throat was sore, my breathing labored. The physicians attended me with their arts, but the illness deepened swiftly. I perceived that my hour was come. I asked only that all should be done decently, and with as little pain as heaven would permit. On the night of December 14th, surrounded by Martha and a few faithful attendants, I composed myself for the last sleep. My final words were simple: "It is well." And so I departed this life, aged 67 years. In the days that followed, tidings of my death spread swiftly across the land. The nation mourned as one family. Cities tolled their bells, soldiers wept in ranks, citizens gathered in churches to offer prayers. In foreign lands, 2 tributes were paid. For though I had never sought glory, the world seemed to recognize in me the symbol of a cause greater than any man, the cause of liberty. I cannot say how posterity will judge me. I was but a man, with faults and limitations like any other. I erred at times, I faltered, I doubted. But I can say with truth that I never sought power for myself, that I strove always to place the good of the country before my own. If in some measure one succeeded, it was by the grace of Providence, and by the courage and sacrifice of countless others whose names are less remembered but whose deeds were no less vital. Now, as I speak to you across the gulf of years, I wish to leave but one thought in your hearts. Remember that the Republic we founded is not a gift that can be possessed without effort. It is a trust placed in the hands of each generation. It demands vigilance, virtue, and sacrifice. It must be nourished by unity, defended against faction, and preserved from the temptations of tyranny. My life was spent in service, not for the sake of honor, but for the hope that freedom might endure. If that freedom lives still, if the people of America cherish it, guard it, and pass it on, then all my labors, all my struggles, all my years of care will not have been in vain. I was George Washington, a farmer, a soldier, a servant of the people, and this was my life.